Between September 1939 and June 1941, Germany swept through Europe with a series of rapid military victories. Within months, the map of Europe was redrawn. Poland fell in just 5 weeks, followed by Denmark, which collapsed in a matter of hours. Norway surrendered after 2 months of fighting. Even France, which had withstood 4 years of German attacks in World War I, fell in just 6 weeks. For decades, people believed Germany won because of better weapons, brilliant generals, or an unstoppable force. But the real explanation is more complex. Germany's early success came from a specific set of conditions that existed only between 1939 and 1941. The peace settlement after World War I contained cracks from the very beginning. One country spent 20 years preparing for a new kind of war while others prepared for the old one. Economic pressure and political fear created opportunities for aggressive action, and temporary advantages that seemed overwhelming in 1940 disappeared by 1943. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to November 1918, when the victors of World War I tried to build a peace that would prevent another war, but the settlement they created would prove unable to hold. Section 1. The Fragile Peace. When World War I ended in November 1918, European leaders faced an impossible task. The war had killed 10 million people and destroyed 4 empires. On one side, the winners demanded security from future attack. On the other, the losers simply wanted a chance to survive and rebuild. In the end, the peace treaty that emerged satisfied almost no one. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, tried to solve 2 problems at once but ended up solving neither. France wanted Germany weak enough that it could never invade France again, while Britain wanted Germany strong enough to buy British goods and help Europe's economy recover. These goals worked against each other, which meant the treaty failed at both, leaving France insecure and Germany economically unstable. British economist John Maynard Keynes saw the problem immediately. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in December 1919, Keynes explained that Europe formed a single connected economy. Germany could not be kept poor without making all of Europe poor, but if Germany was allowed to grow strong, France would feel threatened. The treaty, Keynes wrote, damaged the complicated system through which European people earned their living. He predicted the settlement would create long-term problems, and he was right. The treaty also created political problems by applying its principles inconsistently. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points promised that people should govern themselves, and based on this idea, new countries were created, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Old empires were broken apart as the principle was applied across Europe, but not to everyone equally. More than 3 million Germans found themselves living in Czechoslovakia after the borders were redrawn, and large German populations ended up in Poland as well. Yet, when Austria's elected parliament voted to unite with Germany in 1919, the Allies forbade it. The treaty said people should govern themselves, but it denied this right to Germans. This inconsistency gave Germany a strong argument for demanding changes to the settlement later on. Beyond the treaty's internal problems, the system for enforcing it proved even weaker. Historian Susan Peterson, in her study The Guardians, the League of Nations, and the Crisis of Empire, documents that the League of Nations, created to maintain peace, could investigate violations and write reports, and it could hold meetings and make recommendations. The first major test came in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria in northern China, violating multiple treaties that Japan had signed, including the League of Nations Charter that promised to protect countries from aggression. The League sent a commission to investigate, which took more than a year to complete its work. The commission produced an excellent report that confirmed Japan had committed aggression and recommended that Manchuria be returned to Chinese control. In February 1933, the League Assembly voted to accept the report and condemn Japan's actions. The vote was 42-1, with only Japan voting against. Japan's response was simple and direct. Japanese diplomats walked out of the meeting, withdrew from the League, and kept Manchuria. No consequences followed, and observers at the time concluded that a country willing to ignore international rules and accept criticism could get away with violating treaties. The second major test came in 1935 when Italy invaded Ethiopia. Italy's leader, Benito Mussolini, wanted to build an empire in Africa and erase the memory of Italy's defeat there in 1896. In October 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, despite Italy's membership in the League and its treaty obligations. According to Pedersen, the League responded by voting to impose economic restrictions on Italy, including bans on selling arms, providing loans, and trading certain materials. However, the restrictions intentionally excluded the one thing Italy needed most, which was oil. Britain and France feared that truly effective restrictions might force Italy to attack their territories or shipping, and they also hoped to keep Italy as a possible partner against Germany. As a result, the restrictions were too weak to stop the invasion. These failures taught aggressive governments an important lesson. Determined violations could succeed if a country was willing to ignore criticism and leave international organizations. The system depended on countries choosing to obey rules, not on any power to force compliance. Each failure made the next violation easier because the cost of breaking rules kept proving to be minimal. Democratic governments faced an even deeper problem that made enforcement nearly impossible. World War I had created deep psychological scars across British and French societies. Historian Thomas Childers, in the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany, notes that Britain lost 750,000 men killed and more than 1.5 million wounded, while France lost 1.4 million killed and over 4 million wounded. Every town had a war memorial listing local men who never came home, and every family had lost someone. The books and poems written about the war in the 1920s and 1930s emphasized its horror and waste. Works like All Quiet on the Western Front became bestsellers by describing the misery of trench warfare in graphic detail. A generation had grown up hearing these stories and seeing disabled veterans on every street, which meant politicians understood that public opinion would support another war only if the threat was absolutely clear and every other option had been tried first. This created an imbalance that aggressive governments could exploit. In Germany, after Adolf Hitler took power in January 1933, decisions could be made quickly and in secret. Hitler did not need to ask Parliament for permission or wait for public opinion to shift, which meant he could order military action and have troops moving within days. Democratic leaders in Britain and France, by contrast, needed cabinet meetings to reach agreement, parliamentary debates to build support, and time to prepare public opinion for any strong action. Each step took days or weeks, which gave aggressive governments time to create facts on the ground before democracies could respond. These constraints were not signs of weakness or lack of will, but rather the expected results of democratic systems where leaders required public support and institutional agreement before taking military action. In March 1936, Germany decided to test whether anyone would actually stop them. German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region along the Franco-German border that had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, meaning Germany could not station troops or build fortifications there. Germany had confirmed this arrangement in 1925 by voluntarily signing the Locarno treaties, but now Hitler ordered troops to enter the Rhineland in clear violation of both agreements. Historian A.J.P. Taylor, in The Origins of the Second World War, documents that the military balance at this moment was completely one-sided. France had an army of 900,000 men with modern equipment and training, while Germany's military had been limited by treaty to 100,000 men, and the rearmament that Hitler had begun was still in early stages. German troops entering the Rhineland had orders to withdraw immediately if France acted, and Hitler himself later admitted that Germany would have retreated if challenged because the military simply was not ready for war. France, however, chose not to respond militarily. General Maurice Gamelin, the French chief of staff, told the government that stopping Germany would require calling up reserve soldiers and possibly lead to a long war, which political leaders were unwilling to risk given public opposition to military action. Britain declined to support enforcement, as British public opinion saw the Rhineland as German territory and did not view the violation as worth risking another war. The League of Nations condemned the violation but took no enforcement action, and after weeks of diplomatic protests that led nowhere, the crisis simply faded. German troops stayed in the Rhineland. According to Taylor, Germany drew an important lesson from this episode. Treaties could be violated without serious consequences if a government was willing to act boldly and the other side was uncertain. Each success made the next challenge easier to attempt, and the pattern would repeat with increasing boldness over the next 3 years. Meanwhile, by May 1936, Italy had conquered Ethiopia, and in July, the League lifted its failed restrictions. Aggression had succeeded again, and the international system had proved powerless to prevent it. Germany had learned its lesson and was ready to push further. In March 1938, Germany moved again by annexing Austria. German troops crossed the border on March 12 and met no resistance, as Austria's government, under pressure from local supporters of union with Germany, did not fight. However, Britain and France protested formally, but took no action. The union between Germany and Austria, forbidden by the treaties of 1919, was now a fact, and the international system had failed to prevent it. 6 months later, in September 1938, came the crisis over Czechoslovakia. Germany demanded that Czechoslovakia hand over the Sudetenland, a border region where more than 3 million Germans lived. Hitler claimed these people were being mistreated and should be allowed to join Germany. The crisis came to a head when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany for direct negotiations with Hitler. After tense weeks that brought Europe to the edge of war, Britain and France agreed at Munich on September 29th to Germany's demands, and Czechoslovakia was forced to accept. Chamberlain returned to London and announced that he had secured peace. Many people in Britain and France felt relieved that the war had been avoided, but 6 months later, Hitler would reveal what his promises were really worth. In March 1939, these promises proved false. German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist as an independent country, absorbed into Germany's growing territory. Only after this clear betrayal did Britain and France finally commit to stopping further German expansion. In late March 1939, Britain guaranteed Poland's independence, promising to declare war if Germany attacked, while France confirmed its existing treaty with Poland. But these guarantees came after years of failed enforcement and broken promises. Small countries across Eastern Europe had watched the pattern unfold and drawn their own conclusions, understanding that Western promises of protection meant little when the moment came to actually fight. By mid-1939, everything the treaty builders had worked for lay in ruins. The international system created after World War I had effectively collapsed. The League of Nations was irrelevant, treaties were being violated openly, and collective security, the idea that countries would join together to stop aggression, had failed every major test. Countries seeking to change the existing order had learned they could act boldly with little risk. Meanwhile, the very structure of the peace settlement, with its internal contradictions and weak enforcement, had created the conditions for this breakdown. The stage was now set for the next phase. While the international system was failing, one country had been preparing systematically for a very different kind of war than the one its potential opponents expected. Section 2. Germany rebuilds in secret. While diplomats argued about treaties in the 1920s and 1930s, the German military was developing new approaches to warfare. This transformation did not begin with Hitler, but rather started in 1920, when General Hans von Seeckt became chief of the German army. Military historian Robert Citino, in The Path to Blitzkrieg, Doctrine and Training in the German Army, 1920 to 1939, emphasizes that Siekt's experience had been different from most generals. Instead of commanding on the Western Front, where trenches and machine guns created deadly stalemate, he had served in the East, where the vast distances and lack of continuous fortifications allowed armies to move and maneuver. This experience showed him that mobility could still win battles, even with modern weapons. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany to an army of just 100,000 men, with no tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery allowed. Most officers would have seen this as a problem. However, Siekt approached it differently. With only 100,000 men permitted, he decided to make each soldier a potential leader for future expansion. Private soldiers received training as future sergeants, while sergeants trained as future officers, and officers studied command at the level above their current positions. This created a system that other armies had not developed. Siekt called this concept the Führerheer, which meant an army of leaders. The idea was straightforward. When Germany eventually expanded its military, these 100,000 men would multiply, with privates commanding squads, sergeants commanding platoons or companies, and officers commanding battalions or regiments. This multiplication factor was not part of how other European armies were organized at the time. The French and British, by contrast, maintained conscript armies with short-term soldiers, and their reserves consisted of men who had served years earlier. As a result, Germany's approach focused on training leaders for a future army that did not yet exist. In 1921, the German army published a new field manual called Führung und Gefecht, which meant leadership and battle. According to Citino, this document established principles that would guide German operations for the next 2 decades. The manual emphasized mission-type orders, which meant commanders would tell subordinates what needed to be accomplished and why, but would leave the methods up to them. Consequently, this encouraged quick thinking and adaptation to changing situations. French and British military doctrine worked differently. Their field manuals gave detailed instructions about exactly how to accomplish tasks, specifying which units would advance, which roads they would use, when they would move, and how they would be supported. This created uniformity and coordination. However, it also made armies slow to adapt when situations changed in ways planners had not expected. The German manual also stressed that all parts of the army had to work together constantly, which meant infantry, artillery, and engineers were not separate forces that operated independently, but had to coordinate their actions at all times. The manual rejected the idea that any single weapon or branch could win battles alone, and instead argued that victory came from combining different capabilities in coordinated action. Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, the German army conducted large field exercises every autumn to test these ideas in practice. Foreign military officers who attended as observers consistently reported similar impressions about how German units operated during these exercises. Units adapted to new situations without waiting for orders from above, machine guns were positioned to support advancing infantry, and junior officers made independent decisions that showed understanding of the larger mission. Citino documents that American Army observer Colonel Conger at the 1926 maneuvers wrote that Germany was training an army of technicians who emphasized quickness of movement. A year later, Colonel Zornig, who observed the 1927 exercises, noted that machine gun units displayed great skill in positioning. Then, in 1928, Colonel Carpenter reported that troops remained smart and enthusiastic in appearance even after 3 days and 2 nights of continuous operations, highlighting the demanding physical and mental challenges these exercises created for junior leaders. As Germany began openly rebuilding its military in the 1930s, tank doctrine became a central focus. A tank officer named Heinz Guderian developed ideas about how armored forces should be used. Guderian argued that tanks should not be spread out along the entire front to support infantry at walking pace, but instead should be concentrated into independent armored divisions that could break through enemy lines and drive deep into rear areas at 50 kilometers per day or more. This differed from how France and Britain were organizing their tank forces. The French had tanks that were often well-armored and well-armed, and in fact these were sometimes superior to German tanks in these aspects. However, French doctrine spread these tanks across the front in small groups attached to infantry divisions, where they would help infantry advance at the slow pace of men walking. German doctrine, by contrast, called for massing tanks at a single point to create overwhelming local superiority, then using that breakthrough for rapid advances. Guderian also insisted that armored divisions needed to include all the elements required for independent operations, which meant each division would have not just tanks, but also motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance units, all moving together. Radio communication would allow coordination even when units were spread over large distances and moving quickly. The result was a combined force that could operate independently, move fast, and adapt to changing situations. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, developed in coordination with these ground force concepts. The primary mission of German aircraft was to support army operations, not to conduct independent bombing campaigns. Dive bombers like the Stuka were designed to act as flying artillery, hitting targets just ahead of advancing ground forces, while fighter aircraft would establish control of the air over the battlefield so ground operations could proceed without enemy air attacks. All of this development took place while Germany was technically still disarmed. The General Staff, which the treaty had abolished, continued to function under a different name, the Truppenamt, or Troops Office, while the War Academy, also forbidden by the treaty, operated in secret. Officers attended courses that were called leadership training rather than staff college, but the substance was the same. As a result, doctrine development never stopped. Planning for future war continued, and when rearmament began openly in 1935, the intellectual groundwork had already been laid. In 1936, Hitler appointed Hermann Göring to lead what was called the Four-Year Plan. Historian Thomas Childers, in The Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany, documents that the goal was to prepare Germany's economy for war within 4 years. This meant massive investment in synthetic fuel production, because Germany had almost no oil of its own, as well as creating substitutes for rubber and other materials that would be hard to get during war, and expanding steel production, chemical plants, and munitions factories. The program created real military capability quickly, but at a cost. Government spending soared, debt increased dramatically, and the economy was being stretched tight to support rearmament. This approach created a basic problem because Germany needed short, victorious wars that would capture resources from conquered territories, with each conquest paying for itself and providing resources for the next campaign. A long war would expose Germany's economic weakness. This economic situation meant Germany faced strict time limits. The rearmament program created strong military forces by 1939, but it was not sustainable for years of grinding warfare, which meant Germany had to win quickly or face economic collapse, and this time pressure would shape strategic decisions in the coming war. In March 1939, Germany absorbed what remained of Czechoslovakia. This brought two important benefits. First, it removed a potential enemy on Germany's southern border. And second, and more importantly, it brought Czech industry under German control. The Škoda Works, one of Europe's best arms manufacturers, now produced weapons for Germany, and the Czech army's equipment, including hundreds of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, was taken into German service. Some of these Czech tanks, including the Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T, were actually superior to many German designs, and these would make up 1/3 of German armored forces in the campaigns of 1940. By mid-1939, Germany had built a military force organized differently than other armies in Europe. It was not larger than the combined French and British forces, and its equipment was not universally better. However, Germany had created a system where doctrine, training, organization, and equipment all worked together toward the same goal, which meant officers at all levels understood mobile warfare concepts, communication systems supported rapid operations, and combined arms coordination had been practiced for nearly 2 decades. France and Britain, by contrast, had spent the same years preparing for a different kind of war. They had drawn different lessons from World War I, and historians argue that those lessons would prove poorly suited to the conflict that came. When the campaigns of 1940 began, French tanks would often be superior to German tanks in armor and firepower, yet this advantage would not be enough to overcome the differences in doctrine and organization. Section 3. Why the Allies fell behind. While Germany developed concepts for mobile warfare in the 1920s and 1930s, France and Britain drew very different conclusions from World War I. Their experience of that war had been the Western Front, where defense dominated and attacks achieved little at terrible cost. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 cost over 600,000 Allied casualties for an advance measured in miles. Similarly, the Battle of Verdun consumed similar casualties on both sides for no territorial gain. These experiences seem to prove that modern firepower made defense overwhelmingly strong. French military thinking in the 1930s reflected this understanding. The concept of methodical battle called for careful preparation before any advance. Artillery would bombard enemy positions for days to destroy fortifications and kill defenders. Only then would infantry attack to seize limited objectives. After taking these objectives, forces would halt to bring artillery forward and prepare for the next phase. This approach might advance 5 to 10 kilometers per day at best, but it would limit casualties and ensure control of captured territory. The Maginot Line symbolized this defensive mindset. This massive system of fortifications along the Franco-German border included underground barracks, ammunition storage, hospitals, and command posts. Heavy guns sat in armored turrets, while anti-tank obstacles dotted the landscape. The fortifications were considered nearly impossible to penetrate. As a result, the French army trained to fight behind these defenses or to launch carefully planned offensives from secure bases. Mobile warfare, in contrast, received little attention in training or doctrine. British military thinking faced different pressures. Britain's small professional army was designed primarily for imperial duties, including putting down rebellions in India, maintaining order in the Middle East, and garrisoning various colonies. These responsibilities required different skills than fighting a major war in Europe. When Britain began serious rearmament in the late 1930s, the army had to rebuild from a very small base. Historian Lloyd Clark in Blitzkrieg, Myth, Reality, and Hitler's Lightning War, France 1940, notes that equipment was outdated, doctrine was unclear, and training for large-scale European warfare was incomplete. British tank doctrine was confused, pulled between cavalry traditions that wanted fast light tanks and infantry supporters who wanted heavily armored assault tanks. The debate remained unresolved when war began. As a result, British armor was spread across different types of units with different missions and no clear operational concept. The way democratic governments made decisions created another disadvantage in fast-moving crises. When a situation developed, Britain and France needed time to respond. Historian Thomas Childers documents that cabinets had to meet to discuss options, ministers had to reach agreement, which often required compromise between different views, and parliaments needed to be briefed and consulted. Public opinion had to be considered and, in some cases, prepared for action, which meant each step took time. Germany under Hitler's rule faced no such constraints. After 1938, Hitler stopped holding formal cabinet meetings and made decisions alone or with a small circle of advisors. There were no institutional checks on his power. When Hitler decided to act, orders went out immediately, and troops could be moving within hours. This speed advantage meant Germany could create situations that required urgent response, then act before democracies finished deliberating. France's political system added further complications. Governments were always coalitions of multiple parties because no single party could win a majority. These coalitions were fragile and often collapsed, leading to new governments being formed. Historian A.J.P. Taylor notes that between 1930 and 1940, France had more than 20 different governments. Each change meant new ministers learning their positions and new compromises being negotiated. As a result, long-term policy was difficult to maintain. Britain's government was more stable, but still subject to democratic accountability. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain could not simply order war. He needed his cabinet to agree, he needed Parliament to support the decision, and he needed to show the British public that every alternative had been exhausted. When the Munich crisis came in September 1938, Chamberlain felt he had to try personal diplomacy with Hitler rather than immediately threaten war because British public opinion was not ready to fight over Czechoslovakia. This created an imbalance that aggressive governments could use to their advantage. Germany moved first and established facts on the ground. Britain and France then had to decide whether to reverse those facts by force, which meant starting a war. The burden of decision fell on the democracies, while Germany simply acted and waited to see if they would respond. Allied intelligence services actually collected good information about German capabilities and intentions throughout the late 1930s. Historian Ernest May, in Strange Victory, Hitler's Conquest of France, documents that French intelligence penetrated some German communications, British reconnaissance aircraft photographed German military installations, and Polish intelligence provided detailed data on German force organization. Additionally, human sources, including German officers opposed to Hitler's policies, passed warnings about upcoming operations. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was interpretation. According to May, Allied commanders and political leaders filtered intelligence through their own assumptions about what was possible or reasonable. When intelligence suggested Germany might attempt something that seemed reckless by Allied standards, the intelligence was dismissed or reinterpreted. By mid-1939, both sides understood that the race against time could not continue indefinitely. Germany had rearmed to the point where its economy could barely sustain the effort. Britain and France were expanding, but not yet ready. The question was whether Germany would strike before Allied preparations were complete. When war was declared in September 1939, France and Britain were in the middle of military expansion, not at the end of it. France's mobilization plans assumed peak production would come in 1941 or 1942. British rearmament, which had started later, followed a similar timeline. Both countries were building military strength, but they needed more time. The British Expeditionary Force sent to France in September 1939 numbered only 4 divisions initially. These were well-trained professional units, but tiny compared to the scale of combat they would face. France called up reserves and formed new divisions after war was declared, but equipment and training were incomplete. Many units lacked modern anti-tank guns, radios, and other essential equipment. Training focused on the methodical battle concept, which did not prepare units for the kind of mobile warfare Germany would wage. The plan was to continue expanding and training through 1940, reaching full readiness in 1941. Britain's expansion started from an even lower base. The small professional army of the 1930s was being rapidly enlarged through conscription, but conscripts needed months of training before they were ready for combat. Equipment was being produced, but factories needed time to reach full output. The British Expeditionary Force would grow to 10 divisions by May 1940, but plans called for gradual expansion to a much larger force by 1941. This meant both countries wanted time. Every month of peace was a month for factories to produce more tanks and aircraft, for conscripts to complete training, and for new units to form. Taylor argues that the policy of accommodation in the late 1930s was partly motivated by this calculation. Each crisis that was resolved without war bought more time for preparation. But Germany understood this dynamic as well as the Allies did. Hitler knew that time favored his opponents because Britain and France had larger economies, greater industrial capacity, and bigger populations. The longer war was delayed, the less Germany's advantages would matter. This created pressure on Germany to act quickly, to use its temporary advantages before they disappeared. In January 1940, a remarkable event illustrated the intelligence problem perfectly. A German courier aircraft carrying complete plans for the Western offensive got lost in bad weather and made a forced landing in Belgium. The officer on board tried to burn the documents, but Belgian troops captured most of them intact. Belgium shared the plans with Britain and France, and Allied leaders suddenly had exact details of German intentions. At first, this seemed like an incredible intelligence windfall. However, when weeks passed and Germany did not attack, doubts grew. Perhaps the documents were disinformation. Perhaps the plans had been completely changed. As vigilance decreased, Allied leaders convinced themselves the plans were no longer relevant. In reality, the plans had been modified, but not abandoned. The main thrust shifted from Belgium to the Ardennes, but the overall concept of rapid offensive remained. May argues that this pattern of misinterpretation reflected a deeper problem. Allied commanders assumed German generals would think like they did, projecting their own caution and methodical approach onto enemy planning. When Germany did things that violated Allied doctrine and seemed dangerously risky, Allied intelligence analysts concluded Germany must not be doing those things. They reinterpreted the evidence to fit their expectations. When the attack finally came in May 1940, it caught the Allies by surprise, despite the warning they had received months earlier. Section 4. The window opens. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The announcement was unexpected because Nazi Germany and Communist Russia were supposed to be bitter enemies. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, declared that Germany needed living space in Soviet territory, and Soviet propaganda had denounced Nazi Germany for years. Yet now the two countries had agreed not to attack each other. Beyond the ideological contradiction, the pact had important strategic implications. For Britain and France, the pact destroyed their assumption that Germany would have to worry about a Soviet threat in the East. Now Germany could concentrate all its forces westward without fear of Soviet intervention. For Poland, caught between Germany and the Soviet Union, the pact was even more threatening. The treaty included secret provisions dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers, with Poland to be split between them. Historian Lawrence Rees, in Hitler and Stalin, The Tyrants and the Second World War, emphasizes that both Hitler and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin understood the agreement was temporary. Hitler had not abandoned his goal of conquering Soviet territory, and Stalin did not trust Hitler. However, the pact served immediate purposes for both sides. Germany gained security on its eastern border, allowing a one-front war for the first time since 1914. The Soviet Union bought time to prepare for eventual German attack and gained territory it had lost after World War I. According to Rees, both sides were using the other, and both knew it. For Germany, the pact completed the strategic setup. The international system had collapsed. German military forces had been built and trained for mobile warfare, and Britain and France were still expanding their forces and not ready for war. Now, with the Soviet Union neutralized, Germany's eastern border was secure. As a result, every condition favored German action, and the window of opportunity was fully open. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, Germany attacked Poland without declaring war. German aircraft struck Polish airfields in the first hours, destroying much of Poland's air force while planes were still on the ground. Panzer divisions rolled across the border and began driving deep into Polish territory. Poland's military was not weak. It had 30 infantry divisions and 11 cavalry brigades with a total of about 1 million men under arms. Polish soldiers fought bravely throughout the campaign. However, Poland's army had been organized and trained for the wrong kind of war. Polish doctrine emphasized cavalry operations and forward defense close to the border. This approach had worked in 1920 when Poland defeated Soviet forces, but against Germany in 1939, it failed completely. German armored spearheads moved at speeds Polish commanders had not anticipated. Panzer divisions advanced 50 kilometers per day, far faster than Polish units could retreat or reposition to face new threats. Without effective air cover and with communications disrupted by German attacks, Polish units found themselves fighting in isolation. Higher headquarters lost contact with their subordinate units, orders could not be transmitted, and the coordination needed for organized defense broke down within days. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany as they had promised. However, no military action followed. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line. A small French offensive pushed a few miles into German territory in the Saar region, encountered German defenses, and stopped. No serious effort was made to help Poland by attacking Germany in the west. The press began calling this period the Phony War, because France and Britain were at war with Germany but not actually fighting. Meanwhile, by the end of the first week of September, the situation in Poland was desperate. German forces had penetrated deep into Polish territory from multiple directions, and major encirclements were forming as German spearheads cut behind Polish defensive positions. On September 17th, the situation became hopeless when the Soviet Union invaded from the east, as the secret provisions of the Nazi-Soviet pact had been arranged. Poland now faced enemies from two directions, with no possibility of help from the west. Warsaw held out under siege until October 1st, when the city surrendered after days of bombardment. The last Polish field units surrendered on October 6, 5 weeks after the invasion began. Poland ceased to exist as an independent country, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, along a line roughly following ethnic boundaries. The Poland campaign showed that German doctrine worked in practice. The concept of breakthrough and exploitation succeeded. Combined arms coordination proved effective, while the principle of mission-type orders allowed junior officers to exploit opportunities quickly. Radio communication, in turn, enabled rapid coordination despite chaotic conditions. Consequently, German commanders at all levels demonstrated the independent decision-making that had been emphasized in training. However, the campaign also exposed weaknesses that needed attention. Supply lines had extended too quickly for logistics to keep up, and fuel shortages developed in some units. Tank breakdown rates reached 30%, with mechanical failures as much a problem as enemy action. Air-ground communication worked but had room for improvement, and some friendly fire incidents showed coordination was not perfect. The German military spent the next months addressing these problems. More trucks were acquired to improve supply capacity, tank maintenance procedures were revised, and radio equipment was upgraded throughout the force. Air-ground coordination protocols were refined, and lessons were systematically collected from units at all levels and incorporated into training and planning. had been in September 1939. Meanwhile, Britain and France took no offensive action during this period. The phony war continued through the autumn of 1939 and winter of 1940. French forces remained behind their fortifications, and the British Expeditionary Force gradually expanded from 4 divisions to 10, focusing on training and defensive preparations rather than attacking Germany. Section 5. The Collapse. On April 9, 1940, Germany struck north. Denmark fell with. Norway proved more difficult because of its geography and because Britain and France actually sent troops to help. The Norwegian campaign showed Germany's willingness to take risks that more cautious military establishments would not accept. German forces used airborne troops to seize key airports, then flew in reinforcements before Norwegian defenders could react. Naval forces landed troops at multiple points along Norway's long coastline, despite British naval superiority. When British and French forces landed to help Norway, German forces held key points and gradually pushed the Allies back. By early June, after 2 months of fighting, the Allies evacuated their forces from Norway. Historian Ernest May, in Strange Victory, Hitler's Conquest of France, French and British forces moved forward into Belgium to meet what they thought was the primary threat. This was exactly what Germany wanted. The real attack came further south, through the Ardennes forest in Luxembourg and southern Belgium. Allied planners had considered the Ardennes unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The terrain was difficult, with steep hills and winding roads through thick forest. However, German planners had studied the Ardennes carefully and concluded that difficult did not mean impossible. 7 panzer divisions moved through the Ardennes in 3 days, emerging at the Meuse River near Sedan on May 13th. This massive concentration of armor at a single point created overwhelming local superiority, despite the overall balance being roughly equal. French forces in the area were caught unprepared for such a large attack at what had been considered a quiet sector. German aircraft provided continuous support, acting as flying artillery, while French air forces struggled to intervene effectively. The crossing of the Meuse River proved to be the decisive moment of the entire campaign. French doctrine called for methodical preparation before attempting river crossings. Days of artillery bombardment should precede any assault, and careful planning should ensure everything was ready. German doctrine called for immediate attack. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the breakthrough, ordered his forces to cross the Meuse the same afternoon they arrived. French defenders, already shaken by air attacks, found themselves under assault before they could organize proper defenses. By nightfall on May 13th, German forces held bridgeheads on the western bank of the Meuse. The French front had been broken at its critical point. Panzer divisions drove westward toward the English Channel, covering up to 60 kilometers per day. Some German commanders thought the advance was moving too fast. They cut behind the main Allied armies that had advanced into Belgium, severing supply lines and communications. French attempts at counterattack came too late and were defeated piecemeal by German forces that maintained momentum despite stretched supply lines. The speed of the German advance created paralysis in French command structures. French headquarters issued orders based on yesterday's situation, only to find that by the time orders reached units, the situation had changed completely. Units sent to plug one gap discovered that 2 more had opened behind them. Telephone lines, the primary means of communication, were cut by advancing German forces. Radio equipment was scarce, and commanders lost contact with their units and could not coordinate a response to the crisis. German forces, by contrast, maintained coordination despite rapid movement and fluid situations. Every German tank had at least a radio receiver, so all tanks in a unit could receive minutes, while French units took hours or days to receive new orders. Historian Lloyd Clark, in Blitzkrieg, Myth, Reality, and Hitler's Lightning War, France 1940, emphasizes that French tanks were often superior to German tanks in armor and firepower, but they fought in small groups that had been dispersed across the front for infantry support. They could not concentrate quickly enough to counterattack the German breakthrough. German tanks, organized in massed panzer divisions, could be shifted to meet threats or exploit opportunities as situations developed. According to Clark, the difference was not in equipment quality but in doctrine and organization. British forces, operating under French command, faced the same problems. When the German breakthrough at Sedan cut behind Allied positions in Belgium, the British Expeditionary Force found itself trapped in a pocket with its back to the English Channel. Supply lines had been cut, and evacuation became the only option. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated from the beaches at Dunkirk. The evacuation saved the core of Britain's army, but all heavy equipment was left behind. Tanks, artillery, trucks, and supplies were abandoned on the beaches. France fought on for several more weeks, but the outcome was already clear. German forces turned south after Dunkirk and drove toward Paris. The French government fled the capital. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice, ending a campaign that had lasted 6 weeks. France's defeat came remarkably quickly. France had been considered one of the great military powers. Its army was large, well-equipped, and defending its own territory behind prepared fortifications. French tanks were often better than German tanks, and French soldiers had fought bravely in impossible situations. Yet France fell faster than Poland, and Poland had been considered a minor power. Historians debate the primary causes of France's defeat. Some scholars, like Karl-Heinz Frieser in the Blitzkrieg legend, emphasize that German success resulted from improvisation and luck as much as planning, arguing that the campaign nearly failed several times. Others, like Robert Citino, contend that decades of doctrinal development created the conditions for rapid victory. May argues that intelligence failures and perceptual problems blinded Allied commanders to German intentions. What war France had prepared to fight and the kind Germany actually waged. France had prepared for position warfare with methodical advances and overwhelming firepower. Germany waged mobile warfare focused on speed, disruption, and exploitation. When these two approaches collided, the side prepared for mobile operations gained an overwhelming advantage that equipment quality could not overcome. Germany now controlled Western Europe. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France had all fallen. Only Britain remained undefeated, protected by the English Channel and its navy. Germany had established the reputation for invincibility that would shape perceptions for the next 2 years. Small countries around the world drew conclusions about which side would win the war. The Soviet Union, watching from the east while maintaining its pact with Germany, accelerated its own preparations while continuing to supply raw materials under their trade agreements. Yet, even at this moment of triumph, limits were becoming visible to anyone who looked carefully beneath the surface of victory. Section 6. The limits emerge. The rapid victory in France had come at the edge of German capabilities. Logistics had been stretched to the breaking point, with some panzer divisions reaching the English Channel with nearly empty fuel tanks. Ammunition supplies had run dangerously low, and the troops were exhausted from continuous operations. If the campaign had lasted significantly longer, these problems would have become critical. Historian Adam Tooze, in The Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, shows that Germany's economic situation was even more unstable than the military situation. The rearmament program had consumed resources at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. Government debt was enormous, and raw material shortages persisted despite the 4-year plan's synthetic production programs. The conquest of France provided temporary relief by capturing French stockpiles and industrial capacity, but the core problem remained. According to TWS, Germany's economy was structured for short, victorious wars. Through the summer and autumn of 1940, Germany attempted to force Britain out of the war through air attacks and threatened invasion. The Battle of Britain, fought between the German Luftwaffe and British Royal Air Force, resulted in German failure to gain air superiority needed for invasion. As a result, Britain would remain in the war, requiring Germany to maintain forces in the West while contemplating operations elsewhere. In December 1940, Hitler made a decision that would determine the outcome of the war. He signed Directive 21, ordering preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union. This decision has been debated by historians ever since. From one perspective, it made strategic sense. The Soviet Union was Germany's ultimate enemy in Nazi ideology. Soviet resources, especially oil from the Caucasus and grain from Ukraine, were exactly what Germany's economy needed. Defeating the Soviet Union would eliminate Britain's last potential ally on the European continent and might force British surrender. From another perspective, the decision was strategically disastrous. It created the two-front war that German strategy had always sought to avoid. Britain remained undefeated in the West, and now Germany would face the Soviet Union's enormous manpower and vast territory in the East. The temporary advantages that had brought success in 1939 and 1940 were already beginning to erode, yet Germany was committing to an even larger campaign. On June 22, 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union with over 3 million men in the largest invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, achieved enormous initial successes. Soviet forces were caught unprepared despite warnings. German armored spearheads achieved breakthroughs similar to those in France. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured in massive encirclements, and German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers in the first weeks. But the Soviet Union did not collapse as Poland and France had collapsed. Soviet forces fought with desperate determination, and Soviet industrial production continued, with factories being moved beyond German reach to the Urals and Siberia. The vast distances absorbed German advances without breaking Soviet resistance. By December 1941, German forces were stalled outside Moscow, exhausted and short of supplies. The quick victory Germany needed had not materialized. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler made perhaps his most unnecessary mistake. He declared war on the United States, though Germany was not required to do so by any treaty with Japan. This decision brought into the war a country with industrial capacity that dwarfed Germany's, resources that were essentially unlimited, and eventually millions of trained soldiers. The strategic situation that had favored Germany in 1939 and 1940 was now completely reversed. Germany faced Britain in the West, the Soviet Union in the East, and eventually the United States in both theaters. The Nazi-Soviet pact was broken. The temporary advantages in doctrine and training were diminishing as opponents learned and adapted, and the economic constraints that had always existed were now exposed by the demands of fighting on multiple fronts. The Allies were also learning to coordinate more effectively than the Axis powers. Britain and the United States established combined command structures and integrated their strategies. They shared technology and intelligence, and resources were pooled. The democratic powers proved far better at coalition warfare than the dictatorships. In contrast, Germany, Italy, and Japan pursued separate strategies with minimal coordination, and Italy's weakness meant Germany constantly had to divert resources to rescue failed Italian operations. By 1942, German advantages in training and doctrine were closing as Allied forces incorporated lessons from earlier defeats. British and American units were adopting more flexible tactics. Soviet forces were learning from losses and developing their own concepts for mobile warfare. Intelligence capabilities improved dramatically, with British code breaking providing detailed information about German intentions and capabilities. The gap that had been so wide in 1940 was narrowing. Looking back from 1942 and later, the pattern becomes clear. Germany's early success between 1939 and 1941 resulted from multiple factors that all aligned temporarily. The international system created after World War I had collapsed, removing institutional constraints on aggressive action. Germany had prepared systematically for mobile warfare while opponents prepared for position warfare. Democratic decision-making created delays that authoritarian Germany could exploit. Germany's burst rearmament strategy peaked at exactly the right moment. The Nazi-Soviet pact secured Germany's eastern border, and Allied mobilization was incomplete. Every one of these advantages was temporary. The interwar system's collapse ended once the major powers united against Germany. Doctrinal advantages diminished as opponents learned from defeats. Democratic caution disappeared once war became unavoidable. Germany's economic strain grew worse with time, while Allied production soared. The Nazi-Soviet pact was broken by Germany's own attack, and Allied forces eventually grew far larger than Germany could match. The victories of 1939 to 1941 were real, but they were achieved under specific conditions that could not last. Germany had a window of opportunity that was always going to close. The question was whether Germany could win decisively before the window closed. By late 1941, the answer was becoming clear. The temporary advantages that seemed so overwhelming in 1940 had proven insufficient to achieve complete victory, and now Germany faced opponents with greater resources, larger populations, and increasing military skill. Germany's military success in the early years of World War II resulted from a brief alignment of favorable conditions rather than permanent superiority. Between 1939 and 1941, multiple factors worked temporarily in Germany's favor, creating a window of opportunity. Historians debate which factors mattered most. Some emphasize structural conditions like the interwar system's weakness. Others focus on military doctrine and preparation, and still others highlight political constraints or specific leadership decisions. What these different perspectives share is recognition that all these factors reinforced each other and none could last indefinitely. By late 1941, the window was closing. Each advantage that had seemed so overwhelming in 1940 proved temporary. Early success often creates illusions of permanent superiority that prove dangerous. Military outcomes depend on more than equipment and courage. Opponents who survive initial defeats can learn, adapt, and eventually prevail if they possess underlying advantages in resources and coordination. The victories of 1939 to 1941 were real and remarkable, but they contained the seeds of eventual defeat. Germany's early success came from temporary advantages that could not last. The story of how these advantages disappeared and what mistakes followed reveals the other side of World War II. Watch this video next.